Hey, it's Steve. In this video, I'm going to show you how I built this 24-inch diameter N-scale layout that runs on batteries and features steep mountain terrain and a waterfall. Okay, so first off, this is going to be a longer video. In a previous video, I showed you how I built the bases for 3 new micro layout projects that I'm working on, and so I decided that with this series, I'm basically going to do one video on each of the layout projects that I'm working on after they get completed. And so it is going to be a longer video. The bottom line is I'm going to need some coffee first before I go ahead and narrate this long video. Okay, better. Let's get to it. Okay, so I'm not going to show how I built the base for this layout since I did that in the previous video, but to recap, it is a 24-inch diameter pine tabletop that I picked up from Home Depot, onto which I just glued and nailed pieces of 2-inch thick insulation foam board that I also picked up from Home Depot. So overall, pretty simple base build in this case, not really a whole lot to do in terms of construction, just gluing and nailing some foam onto a ready-made pine disc. So once that all had dried, I grabbed my handy-dandy Stanley Sureform tool and started shaving down the foam to the general shape that I was looking for this layout. And then it was time to cover everything in Sculptamold, which is now my go-to for my base scenery. As usual, I mixed in some brown paint and even a little bit of black India ink to give it a nice base color. This way, if a piece of it chips off or whatever, down the road, you're not going to have like this stark white hole there. It'll actually be kind of a brown or grayish color, and it won't look quite as bad. Since I was working on 3 layouts at the same time, you can check out the link above for the little 11 to 12-inch diameter layout that I built and had in a previous video. I had to mix up a lot of Sculptamold, so I kept it pretty wet so it wouldn't start drying out on me as I kind of progressed along on these layouts. But because it was so wet and the humidity was really high, it actually ended up taking about a full week for the very thick parts to dry. So it did take a while before I could come back and do more work on it. But once everything did finally dry, I came back and started staining the terrain. So first I covered everything with a wash of watered down brown paint, and then I came back and did the same thing with a wash of watered down black paint. And that really helped to kind of highlight all the cracks and crevices as the black color kind of seeped into those recesses. This always ends up drying much lighter than you think it will, and you can see here what it looked like once it did dry. So now to add some highlights, I just dry brushed the whole layout with some light gray paint. That is a step that really makes the texture pop out, but you have to be careful not to overdo it because you can really kind of ruin your scenery at that point. You have to go back to the previous steps of doing the washes to kind of tone down the highlights if you do overdo it. So just get most of the paint off the brush and just lightly highlight everything, and then you can always come back and add more. But once you get too much paint on there, it's really hard to reverse that and come back and fix it. Okay, so with that done, I painted on some full-strength white glue where I wanted dirt to be, and then sprinkled on some dirt that I picked up from Scenic Express. But anyway, I followed that up by spraying down everything with alcohol, and then soaking things with some watered-down matte medium. You might have noticed that I haven't added any track yet, and I'm already working on advanced scenery work. I kind of noticed that too, and so I decided that I should probably go ahead and add the track before I ended up finishing the layout without it. So anyway, adding and wiring up a track inside of a tunnel that you've already finished is a little bit tricky, but I did manage to get that done. And the rest of the track is just glued down with some hot glue, and then I soldered all the rail joints together so there wouldn't be any electrical problems down the road. I gave the layout a test run, and besides a few stutters here and there from dirty track, everything ran well. I did, though, have a weird problem where the guardrails on the bridge were a little bit too high, and it was rubbing on the bottom side of the locomotive trucks, and so I had to kind of shave those down just slightly so that wouldn't rub there and cause the train to slow down or possibly get stuck on the top of the bridge. So I've never had that happen before. Anyway, I had to shave down those guardrails, which are just plastic, so easy to do, and that really just totally solved the problem. So with the track in place, I could get back to more scenery work, and so I added more glue, grass flocking, then alcohol, and more glue, followed by some static grass. And I did want to also have a road to overlook the waterfall, so I mixed up some Woodland Scenic, smooth it, and spread that on there where I was going to have the road, and went across the track as well to make the crossing. I'll add another coat later on. You can't get the first one right anyway, but with the base coat in place, I added the track and the bridge that extends over the road and the main loop of track. And that's just a display track. It's not going to be operational, so no wiring needed there at all. Just a simple track for displaying cars or trains or whatever. So next it was on to the ballasting. I ballasted the side of the layout that was opposite the road, since that part was more or less getting closer to done. And I just ran some glue along the edge of the roadbed, spread down a layer of ballast, and then doing the usual spray down with alcohol, and then the watered down matte medium. I also went ahead and ballasted the top display track, but had to wait on the remainder of the lower track until I finished the road area. And so to finish that road area, I mixed up some more Smooth It, but added quite a bit of black India ink to it to make it a nice darker black color. But it is going to dry dramatically lighter when it does finally dry. And so you do have to really go a lot darker than what you think you want. Don't color it to be the color that you want when it's dry, because it's going to end up being too light. And so I went ahead, got it really dark based on kind of past experience. And then I smoothed that out across the entire roadway area where I wanted the road and little parking and walk areas to be. And then while that was drying, I added some clump foliage in different areas of the layout and then glued that down as well. And so my camera unfortunately wasn't recording when I finished the ballasting and the other side of the lower loop or planted the trees, but you can see here what everything looked like afterwards. The trees are just all Timberline Sceneries trees that I've used in previous layouts. They're just wire, kind of bottle brush type trees with some flocking on them. They're very durable, which I like for these kind of layouts that are going to be small and portable. So if you hit them, they're not going to break. So all I had to do to plant each tree was just to stick a hole in the scenery with a little screwdriver, put a little bit of glue on the bottom of each wire tree trunk and stick it in the hole, and then good to go. Now, I didn't want my little N-scale people to drive off the cliff into the ravine, so I cut up some pieces of wooden dowel that I had and put a line of posts in along the edge of the ravine, and then try to get them as level as I could, and then just use some wood stain to make them all look, more realistic and aged. And that was pretty much all I did there. I thought about putting some, some thread on there to make like an actual fence that was like a wire fence kind of thing, but realistically, you're not going to see that well anyway, and it just adds detail that's going to break easily. So now I did notice that the Kato roadbed does hang out over the edge of the ravine a little bit, and so I kind of just hid those with some clump foliage, then added a bit more ballast, which was kind of held in place by the foliage so it wouldn't fall off into the ravine, and then glued that in place so that it looked a little bit better along the approaches to the bridge. And then I went ahead and put a black wash on the track and ballast everywhere on the layout to give it at least a little bit of a weathered look. Now, this layout was being built for someone who requested it, and so I did add a little roadside billboard with their store name on it that you can see here. I just printed out the logo on some label paper from the laser printer in my office, and then just stuck that on the billboard that I had built from a kit. I don't remember what manufacturer it was. I got this a long time ago, but it worked for this project here, so I used that billboard, stuck it in there, put that label on there, and I had my finished billboard. So at this point, it was time to work on the controls for the layout. And so I picked up some panel-mounted Blue Line Snail speed controllers to control the layout. Anyway, the plan was to mount the controller in a plastic project box and then glue that into the back of the layout. You might notice one that already has holes in it on the bottom of the screen, and that is because I drilled those using the supplied template. Apparently they must have changed the layout of their control board, and they didn't change their directions or whatever, because the template was completely wrong for the control board, and I just didn't really pay attention close enough before I went ahead and drilled those holes. So I just put the control board on a new project box, marked the locations where I needed the holes with a knife, drilled those out, carved them a little bit bigger with a knife. Oh, I don't really know why I made them as big as I did. I made the one hole like twice as big as what it needed to be. I don't know what I was thinking there, but I did that. It didn't really matter because there's the washers and nuts and everything and knobs that can cover everything up. But for whatever reason, I thought I needed a bigger hole. So the top of the toggle switch and the speed control resistor aren't the same height though either. That's kind of a little bit of an annoying thing. If you mount the little control board to a panel, you're going to end up having it kind of coming in at a weird angle because they're not level with each other. So I had to put a couple washers on the resistor for the speed control, and that leveled everything out so everything would be not coming out at a weird angle and would be nice and flush with the project box. And so then I just added the washers and nuts to the front of the panel, added the knobs, and then here we go, a nice looking control panel that I can use for this project layout. For the control in the front of the layout, I used a nice big red push button that would be easy to see. This is not a switch type button though, it's just a momentary type button, so you do have to hold the button down to actually complete the circuit. I took a smaller project box, drilled a hole in that. So anyway, while it did make a nice smooth hole, it wasn't actually big enough for the switch that I had. And then I thought about carving it a little bit wider with a knife, and then decided that really I could do this a lot easier. So I took a blowtorch because, you know, it's fun to play with fire, and hit the plastic with the blowtorch just for a second or so, and that softened everything up enough to where I could push the button through, and so boom, in there like Prego. Okay, so now here are the completed electronic components. I have the control box, the push button, and a 9-volt battery case to power everything. So, okay, so I carved an opening for the push button on the front of the layout, but then I had to figure out how I was going to get the wire to the back side of the layout since it's a 2-foot distance. And if I hadn't finished the scenery and I had put these in first, it would have been very easy. I could have just, you know, carved a trench in the foam or whatever and put the wires through, and then when everything got covered up by the plaster, it would be fine. But I didn't do that, so I had to figure out how to put a hole all the way through without damaging anything. And I don't have a drill bit long enough. That would have been the easy way to do it. I didn't want to buy a drill bit just for this. And so, but what I did have though is a long piece of threaded rod. It was at least 2 feet long, and I have that blowtorch. And so I heated up the threaded rod until it got really hot with the blowtorch, and then I just simply pushed it straight on through. It was like a knife through butter, went right through the layout, came out the back, and then I kind of went through the back to the front as well to make sure it was cleared out nice and didn't have any little, you know, hangy-downy pieces of foam in there that might kind of make it hard to put the wire through. And you can see here a nice, smooth, clean hole all the way through the layout. And so then I carved the holes for the control box and the battery box in the back of the layout. And then I hadn't actually wired up the push button yet, so I added the wires to that, fed the wires through the long hole, and then I was able to glue the push button box in place with some wood glue. And then I got the wires from that into the control box, as well as the 9-volt battery power supply in there, and tested everything out. And it worked fine, but 9 volts just really wasn't going to cut it for at least a larger and scale locomotive. The speed was just really going to be too slow. And if the track was dirty at all, it would probably just stall and stop. As you can see here, it did a little bit anyway. That was not going to work for a display layout. So I needed more power, that was clear. So I basically just added another 9-volt battery box, wired the two in series, so I'd have, in theory, 18 volts. But 9-volt batteries really actually produce more like 8 volts besides those first few minutes. And so really it was going to be more like 16 volts, which would be sort of more typical for a regular, you know, DC controller. So that was going to be fine. I wasn't worried about that. So anyway, this worked out a lot better. And then you may have also noticed that I added another toggle switch on the control board. So what I did was to add another double pole switch to control the push button. So the way this is wired is that one of the output wires from the controller goes straight to one side of the track. The other wire goes to the middle terminal of the toggle switch. Then the white wire you see here goes to the push button, with the blue wire coming from the push button back to the toggle switch. And then another wire from that same terminal going to the track. And so if a toggle switch is thrown in the one direction, it sends power from the wire from the control board directly to the track. And then if you throw it in the other direction, it sends the power to the push button. And then if you push the button down, the power then gets routed to the terminal on the bottom of the toggle and then right to the track. So this works out really nicely. So you can use a push button or not use a push button depending on how you want to have things operate. So once I got that soldered up and tested out, you can see here the train ran at a much faster speed. And then if I flip the toggle, it stops the train. But then if you push the button and hold it, the train runs again. So everything worked out really great. So I got the project box all packed up there with the wires and everything closed up. And then I got the hot glue gun heated up. And besides gluing in the control boxes and the battery boxes, I also needed to install some pieces of clear plastic on the ends of the top display track to keep whatever was up there from rolling off, you know, one side or the other of the track. And the plastic came from my scrap box of model kit pieces. They were windows from some kit, probably a Walther's kit, most likely. So anyway, I rounded off the corners and the edges of those so they wouldn't be too sharp, and then glued those on either side of the track on the upper level. This way they wouldn't be too sharp and they would hold the cars in place, and everything theoretically would work good. And so I used the hot glue as well to glue in the control boxes. But you can see obviously that there was some gaps around the boxes. So I mixed up a small batch of Sculptamol with some brown paint again, and then used that to patch around the control boxes on the back of the layout as well as around the button box in the front. And it looks kind of bad here, and the color is weird, but again, it's wet at this point in time. It's going to dry closer to the original color, and then I kind of touched everything up once it did dry. And then obviously I got a bunch on the control boxes as well, and I cleaned that up as well. So it did eventually look fine, but at this point it was a little bit messy. So the last big piece of the layout was to complete the river and the waterfall. So I used the same technique that I used on the previous 12-inch layout that I built recently, And the way that works is I mixed up some 2-part Envirotex epoxy and then took a stretched out cotton ball, and then I mixed that into the epoxy until it was thoroughly saturated, and then used a couple pairs of tweezers to pull it out and place it on the top section of the layout. Then I took a few more pieces of cotton and soaked those in the epoxy and put those on the layout as well, and poured the remainder of the epoxy on the bottom river section. I added a couple more little bits of epoxy soaked cotton in places, and then I just worked at it for a while with a pair of tweezers. You actually do need to have a pair of tweezers or some type of other pointy object, since the cotton and epoxy will stick to your tweezers or whatever you're using, and you'll end up kind of pulling it off the layout. And so you need to have two of them. You can kind of keep working and kind of hold the cotton down with one, and then use the other tweezer to kind of manipulate it and create the little ripples and rapids and everything else that you're trying to do. And then I just kept working at it until it looked realistic in the waterfall and in the rapid section. And then whatever waves, ripples, or movement you try to make will pretty much just stay in place until the epoxy dries. Normally the Envirotex epoxy by itself will just always settle smooth unless you kind of work at it right before it kind of hardens up. But with this technique, with the cotton balls in there, it pretty much will just hold its shape, right from the start. And so it works really nice. And as usual, though, with the epoxy, you have to watch out for the air bubbles and try to blow on them as it cures to kind of get most of those bubbles out, so you don't have a really bubbly looking water scene, when it dries. Anyway, I think the waterfall and rapids turned out really nice on this layout project, even a little bit better than my previous attempt on the little 11 to 12 inch diameter layout. And you can see here a few more views of the finished water scene. Okay, so to wrap up the project, I painted the bottom of the layout black so it looked a little bit nicer. And this layout also has a layer of foam on the bottom underneath the wood, and that was just because it's going to fit on a display stand. That was a specific shape, and so this way it could be carved to sort of fit just right in that stand. And then I added a row of fence posts around the top of the layout between the track and the edge of the layout. This way, if a train coming around the curve, like derails, it's not going to go straight over the edge and land on the floor. So I figured that would be helpful to have on there. And then lastly, I added some labels to all the controls as you see here. And so to operate the finished layout, you just insert the two 9-volt batteries, set the controls, and then either use the push button to operate it or have it run in the always on mode. So anyway, this was a fun project to work on, and I'm really happy with how everything turned out. And so is Bigfoot here, who stands guard over the layout, watching everything from the top of the mountain peak. So lastly, here is one more look at the completed layout as it spins around on this motorized turntable. And I really hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks so much for watching. Bye.